So, my legal update today is addressing a recent decision by a federal court in Alabama. So, it's the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Alabama. And that decision deals with the Corporate Transparency Act and its constitutionality. If our listeners remember, early in January, we had Natalia Ulet-Grice on, and she spoke with us about the new Corporate Transparency Act that went into effect January 1, which requires basically small and medium sized businesses to report certain information to the federal government regarding their company. And it's pretty invasive information, right? So you have to provide your driver's license, certain identifying information, and then any professional, such as an attorney or CPA, who assists their client with the formation of the entity has to also submit their information. They're considered a company applicant, and there's deadlines and timeframes for doing that. But it basically was and will continue to be a pretty significant regulatory burden upon small to medium-sized businesses. Of course, the larger companies are exempted out and they don't have to comply. So really the small to medium-sized businesses are bearing the brunt of this new regulation and reporting requirements. And basically anytime there's even a change to the address of the company, they have to go in and re-report all this information to the federal government. Well, of course, this didn't sit well with certain small to medium-sized businesses and trade organizations. So the National Small Business United, doing business as the National Small Business Association, filed a lawsuit in a federal district court in Alabama for the Northern District of Alabama. And they brought it against the Secretary Yalen. So it's the National Small Business United v. Yalen, or Yalen, in the federal district court. And the National Small Business Association filed a motion for summary judgment, which is basically a motion saying, hey, look, this can be decided on a legal issue. There's no facts at issue. We know what the facts are, which is this piece of legislation, and we have the United States Constitution. And then we just have to compare the legislation with the rights given to the federal government under the United States Constitution to make a decision whether or not it's constitutional. And after briefing on that issue, the court in Alabama determined that the Corporate Transparency Act was in fact unconstitutional on a number of grounds. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into what those grounds are, but basically the court said that the federal government overstepped its constitutional authority, that it had no constitutional right or basis to regulate small businesses in this manner. And as a result, it's unconstitutional. So what does this mean? Well, it means there's going to be more court cases. There's going to be more litigation. There's going to be appeals. And so the next step basically is I'm sure the federal government's going to appeal to the Circuit Court of Appeals, which is basically the court right above the district court and right below the United States Supreme Court. And so they will appeal to that Court of Appeals. There will likely be a 3-judge panel that will hear arguments on the case, and then they will make a decision whether or not the district court's ruling was correct. And so they will decide whether they believe the Corporate Transparency Act is constitutional or whether or not the federal government has overstepped its constitutional authority. Whoever wins or loses at the circuit court level will likely appeal to the United States Supreme Court. So that's the highest court in the land. And the United States Supreme Court will then decide whether or not they even want to hear the case. But assuming they want to hear the case, which I'm guessing they probably do, because it's of fairly national importance, they will then hear arguments on that case. And then the court will make a decision whether or not the Corporate Transparency Act is constitutional. And that will be then the final decision and forever deciding this issue of constitutionality of the Corporate Transparency Act. So if you're a real estate investor that operates using LLCs, for example, what does that mean for you? Well, in my opinion, it means you continue to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act, because this isn't over and there's still a long ways to go within the court system. And so what happens a year from now when the United States Supreme Court makes a decision and maybe they rule that it is constitutional and you haven't complied? Well, then all of a sudden, you're having to run around and make sure that you do comply to avoid, penalties and uh, the consequences of not complying with the act. And so, in my opinion, it's better just to comply and hope that we will have a decision by the United States Supreme Court that finds that this act, is unconstitutional, and nobody has to comply. Our law firm, being a company applicant, we will continue to comply and submit the information for any entity that we assist with the formation. And so for us, it's business as usual. We will continue to comply until basically the United States Supreme Court tells us otherwise. So while this was a big win for real estate investors, for small to medium-sized businesses, it's not the end of the story. And my recommendation is to continue to comply with the CTA, and our firm's going to do that as well. When we assist our clients with forming LLCs, we will continue to comply. And then let's just hope, as it works its way through the system, that the district court's decision is upheld, and this piece of regulation and burden on small to medium-sized businesses is no longer in force and effect through the United States Supreme Court and a decision there.